Thrusters are a new mechanic in Factorio Space Age, and they are intentionally designed to be a bit unintuitive and hard to control. For the most part, you can get away with just feeding them the right colored Gatorade and making sure your fuel production exceeds demand, but with the appropriate knowledge, you can not only get better fuel efficiency out of them, you can program them to automatically regulate their fuel usage and throttle up or down how much thrust they are producing. We'll start with fuel economy. Specific impulse is a term you might be familiar with from Kerbal Space Program. It's a measure of how much thrust you get per unit of propellant. The better the specific impulse, the more velocity you get per unit of fuel. In real-world astrophysics, this is a measure of delta V versus fuel consumed, but since outer space in Factorio has drag for some reason, and will constantly slow you down, it's not quite that simple. Thrusters have to be firing constantly in order for you to go anywhere, and therefore, our specific impulse is a lot more complex than speed divided by fuel. If you want to know the exact formula for platform speed, it's this, which is a lot to take in, but my understanding of it is that your speed is primarily governed by the width of your platform, and then by its weight. As to managing your thrust-to-weight to drag ratio, that kind of math is a bit beyond me, but for fuel consumption, there's a lot of nuance. Gaze upon this table and feel your eyes glaze over. For starters, let's knock off the quality component. Higher quality engines function identically, just at higher speeds. They consume more fuel per second to achieve those speeds, but the relative fluid consumption is the same. Now, as you can see, the specific impulse, referred to here as relative fluid consumption, gets much better at lower internal fuel values. The minimum thrust that a thruster can provide is 10% of maximum. This provides a lot of thrust per individual unit of fuel, but at this strength, you won't really get anywhere unless you use a lot of thrusters. And since thrusters can only be placed on the south side of the platform, and speed is limited by platform width, you can't just spam low-power thrusters to get excellent fuel economy and actually expect to get anywhere. Maximizing your specific impulse is not the best plan. We need to find a balance between power and fuel economy. At the high end of the tank, between 80 and 100% fuel in the thruster, performance is identical with a slight boost to fuel efficiency at 75%, without any loss of thruster strength. This performance boost is only 4%, and at 70% fuel, you lose 2% of thruster strength for a total of 7% fuel efficiency. And, depending upon how you look at it, this may be the butter zone. Virtually no loss in performance, but better mileage. Alternately, you could go for a more balanced approach. 45% fuel reserves provides pretty much balanced performance between fuel efficiency and thruster strength, with 75% fuel economy and 78% strength. A net gain of 24% specific impulse at a cost of 22% of speed. Whether or not you actually want this bonus fuel performance is going to be determined by how much of your asteroid economy and platform real estate you want to dedicate to fuel production. And for the majority of cases, you might not even want to bother at all. But if you're like me and want to tinker with your toys, here is how you can accomplish fuel management. Your first instinct is going to be to use an overflow valve to regulate the level of fluid placed into a tank. For instance, if you wanted a tank to stay 80% full, you'd set the pump to only run if the tank is less than 20,000 units full. This is precisely the wrong approach, unfortunately. It actually feels like a trap. If there is literally any fluid in a pipe extent that leads to a thruster, the thruster will suck it all up until it is full. Machines work the same way, which is why my jury-rigged soup pipes work the way they do. This approach would work great if you could hook thrusters up to circuit networks to read the internal fuel, but for no particular reason other than to make it more difficult to regulate fuel, you can't. Same reason why you can't rotate thruster fuel inputs, which is deal with it. Instead, we need to provide only enough fuel to that pipe extent for the thrusters to stay operational and not an ounce more. Gracefully, fluid can pass through an engine without being consumed by it, so if your thrusters are daisy-chained, the first one doesn't just drink everything. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense until you remember that pipe extents have instantaneous throughput. Place any unit of fluid on a pipe extent and that fluid teleports to all segments of that extent simultaneously regardless of what's in its path. This isn't true for pumps, as pumps separate pipe extents and prevent backflow, but it is true for machines that have two-way valves like thrusters. This is really fortunate for us because it means that there are few, if any, limitations to our pipe routing. For the sake of sanity, you may want to ensure that both the fuel and oxidizer lines have the same total capacity, so that no matter what, the supply will be equal between both. This isn't necessary, however, as in actuality, in order to optimize your fuel consumption, you really only need to restrict the flow of one fluid component, not both. If the machine is receiving its full ration of oxidizer, but only half of the fuel that it can use, it will still only use half as much of both. A small mercy. You can actually alter the color of your jet cones by screwing with the fuel oxidizer balance, so you can just do this for aesthetic reasons. But for now, I'll cover regulating both fluids. We begin by creating a clock. This is a decider combinator with a wire running between its input and output, with a condition set to output if that condition is less than 60. If the condition is provided to the decider, it will increment the number of the condition by 1 every frame until the condition is more than 60, which fundamentally resets the condition once per second. 60 is the amount of update ticks that Factorio makes every second. This increment of time is sometimes called an update, UPS, frame, or technically also a jiffy, but that's likely to turn a few heads. When making a clock or a memory cell, it's important to use a different colored wire to run between its input and output than the ones it's using to communicate with other entities. It can get pretty messy otherwise. You can use a clock with more or less frames before resetting, which will result in more or less precision. For starters, we can initialize the clock by setting it to A less than 60 output A as input count, and a constant combinator set to constantly output A equals 1. From here, we want to calculate how much fuel we want these engines to use. At 100% consumption, they consume 120 units per second per thruster. So, if we want 3 thrusters to operate at 100% strength, we need to provide 360 units per second. However, the supply rate of fluid pumps is locked at 1200 units per second, and can't be influenced by anything except quality, which is why we set up the clock. We're going to be using a little something called
pulse width modulation.
More accurately called duty cycle control under these circumstances. You can use either term, and if someone is an engineer or has binge-watched too much Technology Connections, they'll know what you're talking about. The basic concept behind duty cycle control is that we want these pumps to operate at a specific ratio of time in order to modulate their function to demand. In this circumstance, we want 1200 unit per second pumps to output 360 units per second, so they should only operate 33% of the time, which with 60 updates per second means they'll be off for 40 updates, on for 20 updates, and then repeat. In practice, there's a bit of lag to this system because fluids adhere to Zeno's paradox or something, and like to approach zero in increments of half or whatever. Asymptotes, sine curves, I'll just call it shoddy programming. The result is that while this system is designed to provide 360 units per second, actually only provides around 300. Which, incidentally, is exactly optimal, provided you're going for that 70 to 75% butter zone. But somewhat infuriatingly, this means you can't solve for duty cycle strictly as a mathematical formula, unless you want to bust out a graphing calculator or something. Results should at least be pretty consistent, however, so it ultimately just comes down to a process of trial and error. Carefully tuning your engine choke until you have the right balance, just like a real carbureted engine. Longer pipe extents probably have more lag, so this is an adjustment you might need to make for every individual space platform. But the basic framework remains the same. Calculate the expected units per second required by your engine, and tinker the duty cycle around that amount. If I was to go for the 45% fuel reserve zone, I'd want to provide these 3 engines with a total of 189 units a second, which means a duty cycle of about 9 frames. But due to the fluid lag, probably a little longer than that. We'll hook up the input side of the combinator to the platform hub, set the condition to if V less than 60 and if V greater than 0, and then output B equals 1 and B as input count. Rather than using a constant combinator to trigger the duty cycle signal, we'll instead add an additional condition to the decider combinator. You used to need 2 combinators to do this, but now you can do it in just 1. If I was a better engineer, I could do it in fewer parts. My initial design had the supply pumps operate from frame 0 to frame 20 of the clock cycle, but upon review it's better to have them operate from frame 40 to 60, as then they won't operate when the ship is stationary. A complication is that so long as your engines aren't running, the supply pumps will still be filling the supply pipes, and that means every time you take off, your engines are going to burn at low efficiency until the backup is exhausted. We fix this by adding evacuation pumps leading from the supply pipes back into the fuel tanks, and by having the clock for the supply pumps only tick up if the platform is currently moving. The evacuation pumps operate on an opposite duty cycle of the supply pumps. When the supply pumps aren't running, the evacuation pumps are. This means the duty cycle of the evacuation pumps is 0 to 40. Now, when the platform is at rest, the supply pipes will be empty. The thrusters will never be fully empty, however, which means that they have enough fuel to kickstart the next launch, which will register velocity and start the supply pumps working again. Although if you've copy-pasted your platform build, you will need to enable each pump for a second to prime the engines. As the platform is coming to a stop, the supply pumps will still be running and the thrusters will not be firing, which means they will fill up to 1,000 units. A bit of a hiccup, but with the incredibly limited circuit conditions available for travel from the platform hub, it's just about the best I can do. Spaceships and space exploration had highly detailed signals for whether a ship was currently moving, stopped, stopping, or taking off. But here you pretty much just get a location signal, which never turns off, and a signal for your current speed. Now, we can eliminate a lot of this lag by setting the pumps up directly to the fluid inputs. This takes a lot more space, but allows the engines to run on a shorter duty cycle. You do have to adjust your cycle to be the consumption per engine, however, rather than for all engines. In this case, we want to hit that 45% full zone. We run each pump for just 3 frames every second. At a duty cycle of 60 ticks, that means they only operate when the clock is above 57, and the result is 3 consecutive frames of pumping, which leads to a sloshing pattern, like a heartbeat. But this is a little imprecise, and by shortening the cycle, we can get a more steady reading. Shortening the duty cycle to 20 frames and operating each pump for only 1 frame per cycle results in a pattern that is closer to a vibration, like a heartbeat, if you've had 4 cups of coffee and a pot of tea. One thing that hampers direct pump insertion like this is that every individual pump has an internal buffer of 400 fluid that it will inject with each pumping action, until it runs all the way down. This results in the engines getting a bit more fuel than they should to start and eventually settling on a constant rate, which is somewhat annoying. Now, let's use everything we've learned to build a nice and simple regulated engine cluster. The clock will have the conditions V greater than 0 and B less than 60. I had daisy-chained my circuit network between accumulators, so I was getting a dummy A signal. Don't be like me. The signal outputs are B as input count and B equals 1. The wiring for this clock is an input red wire and an output red wire with a green wire run between its input and output. This prevents the signal from backfeeding. Now we'll have 3 thrusters, and the fuel lines to these thrusters will be completely unrestricted. The oxidizer lines will have 2 pumps wired to the clock. We're going to aim for a 45% full oxidizer reserve, which means each thruster needs to be fed precisely 63 units per second of oxidizer. 63 times 3 is 189. 189 units per second divided by 1200 units per second pump speed equals 15.75%. So we want to aim for a 15% activity duty cycle ratio. On a 60 frame clock, we want the pump speed to be active for a little more than 9 frames. The input pump, which supplies the pipes heading to the thrusters, will operate if B equal to or greater than 51, and the pump leading back into the supply tanks will operate if B less than 51. Only restricting the oxidizer flow saves space and hardware. There's also less to go wrong. But fluids are weird, and theory never survives first contact with reality, so we need to tune up the feed rate. Carefully. By observation. 49 seems to work for this build. For making quick tweaks to systems like this without creating lopsided implementation, we can set the pumps to operate based on B's relative value compared to a second value such as C. If we have a constant combinator outputting C as 49 with the supply pumps set to B equal to or greater than C, and the evacuation pumps set to B less than C, we can change the duty cycle of both pumps simultaneously. This is vital if you're using many different pumps and want to make an adjustment without all of them going out of phase. Or, and this is my favorite part, you can use this to automate changing the duty cycle when the fuel is low. By setting a constant combinator to C equals 49 and a decider combinator set to oxidizer less than 20,000, then C as input count, hook the input up to the fuel tank and the constant combinator, and then hook the output up to the pumps. The supply pumps will operate continuously so long as the fuel tank has more than 20,000 units remaining. As soon as the fuel runs below this amount, the choke kicks in and the duty cycle restricts the fuel flow, turning your platform over from gas guzzler mode to fuel saver. Technically, a ship already does this when fuel is low anyway, since the engines will be running out naturally, but this allows you to maintain a decent speed at a better specific impulse, rather than running full blast until you're completely out and then getting a very weak but very efficient jet as you limp along. It will experience a brief bout of hysteresis when the fuel finally climbs back up to sufficient levels, but that's really no issue, it just looks goofy. It's actually kind of helpful because this flip-flop will automatically regulate your fuel consumption to whatever you're able to provide with your machines so long as your production is above your choke point. This same system can also be used to regulate thrust produced respective to your current velocity. We'll use the same circuit, but rather than activating when fuel is low enough, instead we'll activate it when we reach a desired speed, functionally allowing us to throttle our engines and maintain a specific cruising velocity with a bit of fluctuation. The main weakness of pump-regulated engines is their performance when your ship is struggling for electricity. Pumps output more slowly when low on power, and circuit devices freeze their network output when they don't receive power. This can make them a little dicey to operate when flying out to Fulgora or Aquilo without nuclear or fusion power. The downside of not having to worry about electrical infrastructure on platforms is that you can't isolate or prioritize power to a specific system. On Nauvis, if I was to make a regulated pump system like this, I'd give it a dedicated battery backup behind a power switch so that it can function during a brownout. Can't do that here, though. Duty cycle control is a widely applicable trick of the trade in Factorio, and I can think of a few places to put it to use. Purge belts on Gleba come to mind. If you want a belt to hold product regularly, but also regularly rotate out stock to prevent spoilage, you can do a hell of a lot worse than using a duty cycle. Once again, this is a totally unnecessary application of an overly complicated concept to achieve practically nothing, but it was fun to figure it out. Incidentally, you can also get better fuel economy by just ratioing your fuel production to your optimal specific impulse threshold per thruster. 2 unmodded chem plants, or 1 chem plant with 2 speed 1s and 1 speed 2, will fill a thruster loosely around that 45% zone just fine, making all of this nonsense with circuits largely irrelevant, so long as you can guarantee your production has no downtime.